Last week, players like Stephon Diggs, Alvin Kamara, CJ Stroud, and Travis Kelce all sunk your week last week. That's what we're going through today. We're trying to find players that you can confidently avoid this week in fantasy football. And last week, full transparency, was my first week doing this type of video. It was not the greatest result. I hit on some, I missed on some. We went through a bunch of it last week, and we're making corrections today. So make sure to go down there. Please drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So going down to our first guy right here. I love this player, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers this week at the Denver Broncos. This is just a must sit. This is such a bad matchup. I mean, honestly, I love this player to death. I was big on him since the beginning of this calendar year, but this is not a good matchup right here. First of all, Denver is 13th versus running backs in fantasy football. Now, that is not the worst number in the entire world, right? That's not the reason why I think Chuba Hubbard is a must-sit this week. That is not the reason why. So, first of all, Andy Dalton is not going to be starting this game. He got into a car crash earlier in the week, and so it has been declared he's not playing for them this week as a starter. It will be Bryce Young this week. So, let's just go back to the beginning of this year and remember how awful Bryce Young was and how awful everybody else was around him in fantasy football. 2 games of Bryce Young this year to start the year. 1.4 fantasy points for Chuba and 11.6 fantasy points in a full PPR format. So obviously, 11.6 fantasy points, that's nothing to scoff at. That is not a ridiculously bad matchup or anything like that. It's not like he absolutely tanked your team that week. But let's revisit this Denver being 13th versus running backs in fantasy football. Let's look at it for the last 4 games of what they've done defensively against running backs in fantasy football. So 4 weeks ago, they played Breece Hall and the New York Jets. 3.8 fantasy points in full PPR format. 3 weeks ago, Alexander Madison, he had 10.1 fantasy points in that game. J.K. Dobbins, 18.2 fantasy points in that game. And then Alvin Kamara last week, 8.4 fantasy points per game. This is all in a full PPR format. So again, you take out J.K. Dobbins here, everybody has been mid to really bad against the Denver Broncos over the last 4 weeks. So I think that number is very, very deceiving in fantasy right here. This is just going to be a rough game for the Panthers, and especially with Chuba Hubbard, because Bryce Young just does not provide the fantasy upside needed for any offense to get anything going in fantasy football. I'm avoiding Chuba Hubbard as much as it hurts me this week. Dropping down to our next guy right here. This wide receiver, honestly, has been a massive disappointment. Marvin Harris Jr., I'm not playing him this week. At the Miami Dolphins here. Listen, the easiest thing to say about this one, Miami is first versus wide receivers in fantasy. But that's deceiving. That's totally deceiving because they're 23rd versus running backs. And the way that they've played recently, the teams don't have to throw on them. They literally have just been running all over them, and the Dolphins can't keep up with points, so it's like every team just gets out to a big lead against the Dolphins, and then they just start running on them. That's exactly how every game has gone for the Miami Dolphins this week. Here's the real reason you can't play Marvin this week. This guy has not been good in fantasy football since week 4. Since week 4, 5.6 fantasy points. 0. He put up a goose egg for you in week 6, and last week, 5.1 fantasy points since then. Full PPR. All of that's full PPR since week 4. But here's the even deeper part. I got flack for saying this on my wide receiver rankings video this week. This guy has just simply not looked good on the NFL field. He has not looked good. And you know what? The retort I got was that, well, they're not drawing up plays for him. Well, he's averaging 5 targets the last 4 games. This guy's dropping balls. He's not physical at the point of attack of a ball. I love Marvin Harris Jr., but this guy is not playing up to his ability, and it's honestly a total disappointment, and honestly quickly becoming just ridiculous and just annoying because he should be much better, and it's not the Cardinals' offense's fault always. This guy just hasn't been very good. I'm just going to avoid him until further notice, until he actually proves that he's actually better than he should be, because he's not good right now, and he should be much better. I'm not playing Marvin this week. Dropping down to our next running back here. This guy is someone I also love as well, so it hurts me to say this. Brian Robinson Jr. versus the Chicago Bears this week. I am not playing this. I am not playing Brian Robinson Jr. in this matchup. This is not a good matchup here. Now, let's address Brian Robinson Jr. Every matchup that he's played in fantasy football this year has been, at the very least, serviceable. That's at the very minimum. His floor, literally, if you look on the game screen, on the screen right now, 10.7 fantasy points in a full PPR format. That was the game that he had versus the Cincinnati Bengals in week 3. That was his worst fantasy performance so far in a full PPR format. This is not his week, man. It is not his week. Chicago is 10th versus running backs in fantasy football, and they are likely going to be without Jaden Daniels. And here's something that I've said all week, and I've gotten tons of pushback from the wide receiver video to the running back video to the kicker video. I've gotten a ton of pushback for saying this exact thing right here. They are not going to move the ball like they did last week with Marcus Mariota, if that is the case. If it's Marcus Mariota, it's not going to be the same as last week. Why is that? Because this matchup is so not the same as it was last week. They played the Panthers last week. That defense is horrible. They're playing the Bears this week. So this is not the same matchup here that they had last week. A full game with Mariota versus the Bears defense, coming off a bye week, by the way. That's not a good matchup, man. And Brian Robinson Jr., he's played less than 40% of the snaps in his last 2 games. That indicates to us all, that it should indicate to us that he is still actively dealing with this knee injury that he has been given. So he is not anywhere near fully healthy yet. It's a bad matchup. He's without a starting quarterback here. Hurts me, but I'm not playing Brian Robinson Jr. this week. And I'll tell you one other thing that's for sure this week is Dak Prescott on Sunday night hitting more than 0.5 total yards. And that's what his projection is right now on Underdog. It is totally sweat-free. You're winning free money when you hit the higher on this one. So make sure to go down there in the comments below, grab the link that's there, and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog and play the sweat-free projection for Dak Prescott this week. And they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Dropping down to our next wide receiver right here, Deontay Johnson. You need to just stay away from Carolina Panthers players this week. At the Denver Broncos here, it is just going to be a really ugly week for the Carolina Panthers. It's going to look like it did the first 2 weeks with Bryce Young because obviously, like I said earlier, there's no Andy Dalton this week. It's Bryce Young again for this Carolina Panthers team. It's ugly, man. It's ugly with Bryce Young. With Bryce Young in the 2 games that he had, Deontay Johnson, here's what he did in fantasy. 3.9 fantasy points, 4.5 fantasy points in a full PPR format. That's awful. You can't play that. Denver is second versus wide receivers in fantasy football, and that one's real. Except like the Miami Dolphins one, I don't think that's real. I think that's a fugazi. This one is real because Pat Surtain is a true lockdown corner. I've been saying for all year at this point for people to avoid their wide receiver one versus Pat Surtain if they can afford to. This is a matchup that you can afford to because Deontay Johnson, without Bryce Young, is already a wide receiver 3 territory. And this matchup versus Surtain just lowers his ceiling down, ultimately. That's all it does right here. So you cannot pay me to play Deontay Johnson this week. There's just simply no way because there's no path for him to receive actual upside in fantasy. Dropping down to our quarterback sit of the week. Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders in Las Vegas this week. The matchup should scream everything that's good, right? They're 22nd against quarterbacks in fantasy football, so it's not like this matchup just from a numbers perspective is bad, right? And there's obviously newfound excitement now that they have DeAndre Hopkins coming into town, right? So it should raise the ceiling, theoretically, of Patrick Mahomes in fantasy football. I've been saying this for weeks at this point. In fantasy football, Patrick Mahomes, at this point, is just a big name. That's all he is. His best game this year was against the Atlanta Falcons in Week 3 when he put up 18 fantasy points. That's been his best week of the year. And this was the guy that was drafted within the first 5 rounds at the very least in every single fantasy football format. This guy has been nothing but disappointing in fantasy football this year. And on top of this, let's not forget this. I've been trashing the Raiders a lot lately, and it's very well warranted. But you know the last team that's beaten the Kansas City Chiefs, it was the Las Vegas Raiders on Christmas Day last year. This team, I've been saying this all week too, they have an underdog quality to them. They beat the Ravens earlier this year. That's the biggest upset of the year so far, and they beat the Chiefs on Christmas Day last year. This team has a real underdog quality to them. So until Mahomes shows actual fantasy upside, I'm not playing him. I'm not trusting him this week, and honestly, until further notice, I'm finding answers and other solutions that I can play instead of Patrick Mahomes because I think he's a must bench this week, especially. Dropping out to our tight end sit of the week. Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans here. He's taking on the Indianapolis Colts in Indianapolis this week. And listen, there's been optimism around Dalton Schultz since Nico Collins was put on the IR, right? Nico Collins being there, without him there, it opens up more targets for everybody else in that room because he's dominating everything at this point. Nothing good has happened with Dalton Schultz since Nico Collins hasn't been there. He's been nothing but an utter disappointment. 6.7 and 3.8 fantasy points in a full PPR format is what Dalton Schultz has given us since Nico Collins has missed games. And even in that Buffalo game where Nico Collins left the game early because of the injury, he only had 7.4 fantasy points, and Nico Collins left that game early. He left the game before halftime. So without Nico Collins, he's done nothing different. And Indianapolis is 28th against tight ends. So again, the matchup says otherwise. This is another reason he's featured in this video, is because I think a lot of people will want to play him this week based on how good the matchup is theoretically. But in reality here, this is not a good situation for Dalton Schultz, and that's why he's a must-sit. He had 2 targets last week in a very close matchup, mind you, versus the Green Bay Packers, where CJ Stroud couldn't even throw for 100 yards. The highest amount of receptions that Dalton Schultz has had this year is 4. And the real reason is that their backup tight end out of Ohio State, he's actually been getting more involved as well. I am avoiding Dalton Schultz at all costs this week. I am not playing him, even though the matchup is very enticing. So let me know what your team is looking like so far this week. And if you want to see who the must-start candidates are for this week, click on this video right here.